For me, I think we talk about climate change right now, but climate change just didn't just happen, right? It is a byproduct of a series of events that have impacted how countries have developed, how economies have developed, how certain nations have been able to industrialize and build huge economic growth for themselves. And in contrast, where other countries, whether it's because they're limited by mobility due to visas, you're not able to engage in trade in the same way. And we all know, and if we don't, we should know that, when you think about in the development space, and I've spent a lot of time over the years, fundraising, writing grants. And one of the challenges that I experienced, a few things, but I realized that funding and sort of the type of funding that our collective communities require, it's capacity building. We really need to build the capacity of our people. We need to build our respective capacities so that we can position ourselves and leapfrog ourselves into these new and emerging economies within society, because the reality is these markets exist, whether we're talking about carbon credits or the new biodiversity credits, for people who are engaged in the ocean spaces. There's all sorts of new industry happening, but there's huge gaps, right? And a lot of these gaps are Caribbean and African countries are not equitably engaged in these spaces. Um, and that has to change. So it's easy for us to like uh we can complain, and I have, in a lot of my years, in my early years, I knew that there was a problem, and I would say, from 17, 18 years ago, talking climate change, and no one was really talking climate change. Back then it was very much theoretical, and still for some people today they still find it theoretical. And I think a lot of the work that is our responsibility is how do we ground these conversations so that we take a topic or a word like climate change that is so abstract, but then also so emotionally charged by so many people. A lot of people, when they hear climate change, they feel something, whether it's positive, whether it's disbelief, whether it's like, oh, I don't want to, but that has nothing to do with me. We had a young man in one of our communities, and it's real. His comment was, it was the realest thing he ever could say. Why, one of the community scientists who works with me, she was in her community in the city, and she was just asking people what they thought about climate change and what that meant for them. And this young man said, I really don't have time to think about climate. I'm just trying to watch my back and not get shot. And so he lives in a gang filled community. So like the realities of daily life are real for a lot of people. And so when you come to people with these sort of abstracts where they don't see how they're making money off of this, they don't see how it's impacting them today, and there's the threat of violence and survival that is so real and ever present, whether it's how do I ensure that my child gets food, gets to school, or really, how do I ensure that I don't get shot because of whether it's the war or whether it is, gang situations. So I think it's really important for us to talk and look at climate in within these contextualities of life. And then I think it's important for us to be able to bring these conversations down to a community level. And so this is sort of really where I spend a lot of my time, is working in and with communities, helping to upskill young people and older people, engaging in technology transfer, whether it's installation of weather stations or placement of observation buoys that go in lakes or go in oceans, where we can learn what is the, has there been, what's the oxygen contact, what's the dissolved not nitrogen levels, are there various pollutants. The more that I believe that communities have the tools, the knowledge, the know-how to be able to articulate their realities in the same language that the UN speaks and our politicians are supposed to speak. When our communities can speak those languages, then we can't be hoodwinked and bamboozled, right? But a lot happens above our heads because we're not informed enough, or there's nuances in conversations that we missed. And so while we may be sitting at the table, we're not really, we don't have a fork and knife and there's no food on our plate, you know? So I think what is important now is for us to really strategically position ourselves, especially as young people who are going to be driving the future of this world. And I think that was one of the most interesting things about my time in Uganda is I realized, you guys are a very young generation and you have very old leadership. And this is something that we see in many different, many different countries in Africa, that often the people who are leading our countries do not necessarily reflect the lived realities, the age, the cultural just like nuances of being whether it's a Gen Z or whatever the next one is, right? So like there's a lot of young people. And I think we also have to be intentional that as a world we cannot have more war. And I'm saying this because I think for a lot of the countries in the continent, we're like on eggshells, right? You don't know if something is going to bubble. And I'm bringing in this conversation about peace and security because we cannot build robust economies. We cannot address the challenges of climate impacts when we are at war with ourselves internally, at war with other countries. And I think the narrative of peace and security is going to be something that is going to be extraordinarily important over this next decade throughout the continent as countries transition leadership, but then also as your generation moves into leadership and starts becoming, or whether it's really utilizing your voice. And we've seen examples, like for example in Kenya recently, we saw how the young people reacted towards the IMF and the tax situation. And now not all countries respond the same way, right? A lot of our histories, like in the Bahamas, we often say like, we don't we don't riot, we don't protest. It's very rare. We often would say that we're kind of a very complacent society. I think also a lot of that comes from how our colonial situations unfolded, right? So we will often say, oh, well, we'll wait for the next 5 years. There'll be another election in 5 years. So we're not really a society that truly agitates in the way that you would see the young people in Kenya who were like having nothing. They made sure that their voices were heard as it related to taxation. And I'm bringing up taxation because the decisions that the leaders are making right now, especially I've had the pleasure of attending four different COP meetings, from COP 25, three meetings, to COP 27. The last one was in Egypt that I attended. And one of the largest takeaways is that our leaders are actively making financial decisions that this generation is going to be responsible for. And so it's really important that we educate ourselves so that we understand what these new financial agreements are, how they impact our country's economics, but also, and this is sort of really where I spend a lot of my time, is how do we ensure that that money trickles down to the local community? Because 9 out of 10 times that local community is not in the room. They're not on top of mind of whether it's the governmental spaces, and they're also not in the big business private sector, right? So there has to be mechanisms that we ensure that we are equipping people so that they can equitably engage in the conversations around the development of their communities, the new technologies that can support us, the the new ways of learning that we need to sort of step into and embrace. And the thing is, change is uncomfortable. We don't like change. Most humans really don't like change. And I'm saying this because to create the world we need to see, to create a more climate resilient world, we have to embrace change because the old system has not been of service. although there is comfort in the old system, right? We kind of just know, and some people like to say, well, better the devil you know than the devil you don't, right? But also, I think we have to be part of creating these new financial systems. And I think this is a lot about, probably what Susan's going to touch on a bit on as she talks. But this is what we've been working on with my work. Because I founded my organization 2007, a small grassroots organization in the Bahamas. And over the years, we've been growing and growing and building capacity. And one thing that I can say is that nothing happens overnight. We've registered our company about 5 different times, because especially when you are a smaller business and you don't have the cash flow that enables you to sustain operations, you can fall into a rut. And sometimes when you're in that rut, it's very difficult to climb out. And then once the debt starts piling on, it can almost be overwhelming. And I think it's extraordinarily important for us to know that our most challenging times, whether it is in the moment in your academics, whether it's in your business, whether it's with your family in your private life, these really difficult moments are the ones that shape us. It's like it's the school, it's the PhD or a master's program you didn't know you needed, but you are enrolled in. And sometimes those are like really tough nights. They're really tear-filled nights because it's challenging. And especially for those of us who are in these spaces creating sort of, whether it's a niche space, creating new ideas, birthing new ideas, whether they're organizations or, businesses, whatever they are, um, there's a lot of opposition to change. And when you are doing something that is trailblazing, you may not always have cheerleaders. And so I think it's really important. I think the one thing that I want to encourage you to do is to always listen to your gut. I know you're like, we're talking about climate finance, but I'm saying this because in order for you to be in the position to receive whatever financing, whether it's to support a community project, to start your own business, even to go to school, right? Whether it's a scholarship or research funding. So, what we have to do is we have to build new financial systems. And where I was challenged is I was struggling to receive the sustainable financing that I needed to do the work in my community. I could get small buckets of money here and there, which you're grateful for, and it helps to advance the cause, but it doesn't really give you the sustainability that you need. And so, what I've come to realize is that I really believe how we achieve this financial sustainability for local communities is that we come together and we work together and building out both long-term programs that have impacts in multiple communities, right? And so that our strengths build on each other. So this is what, when I was in Uganda, Samuel and I were talking about how we can work more closely together. And so that has led us into one of the programs that uh, Young Marine Explorers runs is called the Grouper School. And it is a new revolutionary way of learning. And it's really based on having 4 parties a year, 4 global parties a year where we come together. There's dancing, there's culture, there's history, there's science, there's language. It's based on the understanding for us to achieve a global solution to our global problems. We must get to know each other as a global community. We must understand each other, so we have to learn each other's languages. We have to understand our collective problems as one. How are weather patterns changing? How are rain patterns changing in our specific communities? And there's nothing more powerful than understanding yourself in contrast, right? So when you bring people from islands and people from landlocked communities together for a shared learning opportunity, you really see the differences, you see the similarities, and in that contrast is where the magic happens, because that is where we can really, I think, find those innovative solutions. And there is nothing like necessity to drive innovation. And I think the best example of this is DeepSeek. I don't know how much you follow the AI space, but ChatGPT, OpenAI, billions of dollars in the United States was invested in AI, and the US was very intentional. And they said, China, we're not selling you our high functioning chips, like good luck. And they thought they were doing that they were going to, by doing that, they would retain the competitive advantage. But sure enough, nothing drives innovation like necessity. And the Chinese were like, cool, 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 cool. We'll just take what we have and make it better. And that's what they did. And they made DeepSeek with like $5 million, which is like a fraction of what all the AI investments have had in the United States. So I even though we are, challenged situationally, this is what I think breeds such beautiful innovation. And I really think this is how we ended up at the grouper school, because I was like, I can't, as a small island nation, do this by myself. We have to be bigger. And this is how we have grown. And so now what we're looking at is we're building out these modular laboratory systems that have all the technology that you would need, whether it's to explore from an agricultural purpose, looking at soil quality, looking at water quality, whether it's drones, whether it is remotely operated vehicles, both for land and water. But each community, as part of the grouper school, gets outfitted with one of these kits. And these kits now become tools that the community members get trained in, but then it also enables the community to have the scientific and technological expertise to be part of the conversation, whether that is to clearly articulate this is what's happening, this is how the weather patterns have been changing in our community, or whether it is to help advocate from, because at a climate level, and I know I've got 2 minutes, but you started, Samuel, your conversation about activism, right? And like activism essentially needs to be grounded. And sometimes when you're young and you don't really know how, what you have is your voice. And so you use your voice, right? And you will yell and you will scream and you will protest. And I think sometimes as we develop these skills, we realize that there are other ways that we can also advocate. There's other ways that we can drive action. And sometimes, while passion is must be part of the equation, passion, when coupled with data that is scientifically sound and irrefutable, is really the strength, right? Because you can't question that. If you come often, sometimes, especially unfortunately as women, they like to say, "Oh, you're so emotional," blah 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 blah, and then they dismiss you, And so this is where sometimes I think the value of science, the value of data, the ability for us to truly quantify our realities is not only how we will be able to access climate financing, um, but then also how we tell the reality, lived realities of our different communities, and help to drive, whether it's the policy or new ways of being, learning, restoring our respective communities, so that we can address these challenges that we are so deeply faced with. And sustainable financing for me is at the heart of that, because at the end of the day, for island people, especially for Africans who are in the Caribbean, we wouldn't be on sinking islands if it wasn't for, British colonization. Like, we'd be somewhere in a mountain somewhere, dealing with probably something different like drought, but we weren't going to be dealing with sort of sea level rise and being washed out to sea. So I say that while, yes, our colonial history really has gotten us to where we are now and created a lot of the challenges, I think there's an extraordinary opportunity for young people around the world to strategically unite, to come together, to make money that makes sense, to better ourselves, to better our communities, and at the end of the day, create the more peaceful, prosperous, and equitable world that we deserve to live in.